Gabriel first noticed it in the way Lyla's dogs seemed to orbit her, their movements synchronized as though tied to an invisible thread. 4 dogs, each so distinct yet mysteriously connected. There was Archer, the stately German shepherd with piercing eyes that seemed to look through a person's soul. Luna, a lithe and nimble border collie with an almost mischievous intelligence. Miko, the golden retriever with a calm, soothing presence that felt like a balm to any storm. And finally Raven, the small, scrappy terrier with boundless energy and a heart far larger than his size. It wasn't unusual for people to have strong bonds with their pets, but with Lyla it was different. Her connection with the dogs went beyond affection or loyalty. It was as if they understood her in ways even he couldn't. They seemed to anticipate her every move, responding to the slightest shifts in her mood with unerring accuracy. At first, Gabriel chalked it up to her natural gift with animals. Lyla had always been attuned to the world in ways that mystified him. But over time, the patterns began to emerge, undeniable in their strangeness. One evening, the two of them sat on the porch of Lyla's countryside home, the air thick with the scent of rain that had just passed. The dogs lounged around them, forming a loose semicircle at her feet, their heads resting on their paws as they listened to her speak. Lyla's voice carried a warmth that wrapped around him, her words painting vivid stories of her childhood, her dreams, and her hopes for the future. But then, a shift. Her tone softened, her words becoming rhythmic, almost melodic. Gabriel frowned as he realized she wasn't speaking English or any language he recognized. She leaned forward, her fingers brushing through Archer's fur as she murmured the strange words, her amber eyes glowing faintly in the fading light. The dogs responded immediately, their postures straightening, as if they were receiving instructions. Luna let out a soft whine, nuzzling closer to Lyla's leg, while Raven stood and barked once, a sharp, affirmative sound. Miko wagged his tail slowly, a movement full of calm understanding, while Archer turned his gaze to Gabriel, holding him with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. What was that? Gabriel asked, his voice breaking the spell. Lyla turned to him, her expression unreadable. For a moment he thought she might laugh it off, wave away his question with her usual light-hearted charm. But she didn't. Instead, she looked at him with a seriousness that made his breath catch. "You heard it, didn't you?" she asked softly. Gabriel nodded, his heart pounding. "What were you saying? What language was that?" She hesitated, her fingers stilling in Archer's fur. The dogs seemed to sense her unease, their gazes shifting between her and Gabriel like silent sentinels. Finally, she sighed, her shoulders dropping slightly as if she had decided something. "It's not a language you'd know," she said carefully. "It's ancient. Older than this world, perhaps." Gabriel's frown deepened. "What does that even mean?" "Lyla, you're not making any sense." She turned to face him fully, her hands clasped in her lap. "You're right. It doesn't make sense. Not in the way you're used to thinking about things. But that doesn't make it any less true." "What's true?" he pressed, leaning closer. "What are you not telling me?" Her eyes softened, and she reached out to take his hand in hers. "Gabriel, I love you. I've never doubted for a moment that you're the one I want to share my life with. But there are parts of me, parts of my past, my existence that I haven't told you about. Because I wasn't sure you'd believe me." Gabriel searched her face, his pulse quickening. "Try me," he said, his voice firmer than he felt. "Whatever it is, I want to know." Lyla took a deep breath, her gaze drifting to the dogs. They seemed to nod as one, their quiet presence offering her some unspoken encouragement. When she spoke again, her voice was steady, but her words sent a chill through Gabriel. "These dogs, they aren't just pets. They're more than that. They're vessels for a soul that has been with me through lifetimes. 4 fragments of one spirit, divided to guide and protect me. They've been with me for as long as I can remember, in every life I've lived." Gabriel stared at her, waiting for the punchline, the laugh that would tell him this was all a strange joke. But it didn't come. Lyla's expression remained earnest, her eyes filled with a mixture of vulnerability and determination. "You're serious," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. She nodded. "I am." Gabriel stood, pacing the length of the porch as he tried to process her words. "Lyla, come on. That's impossible. Souls? Past lives?" Dogs that he gestured helplessly toward the 4 of them, who were now watching him with unsettling focus. "It doesn't make any sense." "I know it doesn't," she said, standing as well. "But it's the truth. And deep down, I think you've always felt it. Haven't you?" He stopped pacing, her words striking a chord he couldn't ignore. Memories flickered at the edges of his mind, moments when he'd caught Luna staring at him with eyes that seemed too wise for an animal, or the way Archer always positioned himself between him and any perceived danger. Even Miko's calming presence and Raven's exuberant loyalty felt like more than mere instinct. "You felt it," Lyla said again, stepping closer. "You've seen the way they move, the way they understand things no animal should. You just didn't know what it was." Gabriel shook his head, his thoughts a chaotic jumble. Even if I could believe this, why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because I was afraid," she admitted. "Afraid you'd think I was crazy. Or worse, that you'd see me differently. That you'd leave." Her voice cracked on the last word, and Gabriel felt a pang of guilt pierce through his confusion. He turned to face her, his chest tightening at the sight of the tears brimming in her eyes. "I'm still here," he said quietly. "But Lyla, this is a lot. I don't even know where to start." "You don't have to understand it all right now," she said, stepping closer. "Just trust me. Trust that what we have, what we are, is real. And that I want you to be part of this, no matter how complicated it gets." Gabriel stared at her. The woman he loved. The woman who had just upended everything he thought he knew about her and about the world. His mind screamed at him to walk away, to retreat into the safety of logic and reason. But his heart wouldn't let him. Because no matter how strange or unbelievable her story was, he couldn't deny the truth in her eyes, or the love he felt for her. "I'll try," he said finally, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "I'll try to understand." Relief washed over Lyla's face, and she pulled him into a tight embrace. "That's all I need," she whispered. "Just try." As Gabriel held her, the dogs approached, their presence calm but commanding. Archer pressed his massive head against Gabriel's leg, and for a brief moment, Gabriel thought he felt something, a pulse of energy, a flicker of recognition, as if the dog was silently saying, "Welcome." For the first time, Gabriel allowed himself to wonder if Lyla's words might be true. And though he didn't yet have the answers, he knew one thing for certain: his love for her was worth finding them. Gabriel hadn't stopped thinking about Lyla's confession since the night she bared the truth. The idea of the dogs as ancient vessels for a soul that had followed her through lifetimes gnawed at his mind. He wanted to believe her, wanted to support her, but the sheer weight of her revelation made it difficult to accept without proof. And Lyla, sensing his inner turmoil, didn't push. Instead, she watched him with a quiet patience, as though waiting for the moment he would be ready to take the next step. That moment came one rainy evening. The storm outside howled against the windows, but the warmth of the fireplace inside made the living room feel like a sanctuary. Lyla sat cross-legged on the floor, her hair tumbling in loose waves over her shoulders, as the 4 dogs lay around her in their usual formation. Gabriel sat nearby, watching the scene with a mixture of affection and unease. Despite everything, he couldn't shake the feeling that the dogs were always aware of him in ways he couldn't explain. Lyla looked up, her gaze meeting his. "You've been quiet." "I'm still trying to process," Gabriel admitted, his voice low. "It's not every day someone tells you their dogs are ancient soul fragments." Lyla smiled softly, a flicker of sadness in her eyes. "I know it's a lot. I wouldn't blame you if it's too much." "It's not about being too much," Gabriel said, leaning forward. "It's about understanding. If this is real, if what you're saying is true, I need to see it for myself." Lyla studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I thought you might say that. Come with me." She stood, her movements fluid and purposeful, and the dogs rose with her, their eyes gleaming in the firelight. Gabriel hesitated for a beat before following her, his heart pounding in anticipation. They moved through the house in silence, the dogs forming a loose procession around them, until they reached a door Gabriel had never seen Lyla open before. The room beyond was dimly lit by a single candle on a low wooden table. Shelves lined the walls, filled with objects that seemed both mundane and mysterious: weathered books, small figurines, bundles of dried herbs. At the center of the room was a circular rug, its intricate patterns unlike anything Gabriel had ever seen, as if each thread held secrets of an ancient world. Lyla turned to him, her expression serious. "If you're ready to see, I'll show you. But once you take this step, there's no going back." Her words sent a shiver through him, but he nodded. "I need to know." Lyla knelt on the rug, gesturing for him to do the same. The dogs sat around them, their presence a quiet reassurance. From a small wooden box, Lyla retrieved a vial of golden liquid that shimmered as though it contained sunlight itself. "This is an elixir," she explained. "It helps to bridge the gap between this life and the lives before. When we take it, we'll see fragments of what came before us. It won't be everything, but it will be enough." Gabriel swallowed hard. "You've done this before," once she admitted. "A long time ago. It's how I learned to accept the bond. And now it's your turn." He looked at her, searching for hesitation, for doubt, but found none. Trusting her completely, he nodded. "Let's do it." Lyla handed him the vial and took another for herself. Together they drank, the liquid warm and smooth, leaving a faintly sweet taste on his tongue. The room seemed to shift immediately, the air growing heavy with an energy that thrummed like a heartbeat. Gabriel's vision blurred, the candlelight stretching into long, golden streaks, and then everything went dark. When the world came back into focus, it was entirely different. Gabriel stood in a vast desert, the sand beneath his feet warm and glowing with an otherworldly light. Above him, the sky was a swirl of colors, blues, purples, and golds that seemed to pulse with life. Beside him was Lyla, her form shimmering faintly as though she were part of the landscape. She looked at him, her expression calm but expectant. "This is one of our lives," she said softly. "One of many." Before he could respond, the desert transformed, the sand shifting beneath their feet until they stood in a lush forest. The air was thick with the scent of earth and flowers, and Gabriel could hear the faint hum of distant voices. He turned and froze. The dogs were there not as the forms he knew, but as beings of light, their shapes fluid and radiant. They moved with a grace that made his breath catch, their luminous forms weaving around him and Lyla in a dance that felt both ancient and intimate. "They've always been with me," Lyla said, her voice reverent. "In every life they've been my protectors, my companions. And in many of those lives, so have you." Gabriel turned to her, his pulse racing. "Me." She nodded, reaching for his hand. The moment their fingers touched, another wave of energy surged through him, and the forest melted away. Images flashed before his eyes, fragments of lives that felt both foreign and familiar. He saw himself as a warrior, standing beside Lyla on a battlefield, his sword gleaming in the sunlight. He saw them as farmers, working side by side in a golden field. He saw them as lovers in a grand, opulent city, sharing a stolen kiss beneath a marble archway. But not all the memories were peaceful. He saw fire and destruction, the two of them torn apart by forces they couldn't control. He saw himself walking away from her in a moment of anger, her tears glistening in the moonlight. He saw her alone, the dogs at her side, their forms radiating sorrow. The weight of the memories pressed down on him, but one thing became clear through every life, through every trial and triumph, their connection had endured. The dogs had been there too, their presence a constant reminder of the bond that tied them together. When the visions faded, Gabriel found himself back in the room, the candle still flickering on the table. He was on his knees, his breath ragged, as though he had run a great distance. Lyla knelt beside him, her hand on his shoulder, her eyes filled with quiet understanding. "Now you see," she said softly. Gabriel looked at her, his chest tight with emotion. "We've been through so much, together. And the dogs, they've always been part of it." "They're not just part of my life," Lyla said, her voice trembling with emotion. "They're part of ours. They're a bridge between what we were and what we are." Gabriel reached for her, pulling her into his arms. His heart swelled with a love that transcended words, a love that now carried the weight of lifetimes. "I believe you," he whispered. "I don't understand everything, but I believe you." Lyla pulled back just enough to meet his gaze, her eyes shining. "That's all I ever wanted." They kissed then, the room around them fading into insignificance. It was a kiss charged with the weight of their shared past, the promise of their present, and the hope for their future. As their lips met, Gabriel felt the presence of the dogs, their silent approval, a comforting warmth that wrapped around him like a protective shield. When they finally pulled apart, Gabriel rested his forehead against hers. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now," Lyla said with a smile, "we build our life in this moment. Together." And for the first time, Gabriel truly understood the depth of their bond, not just with each other, but with the eternal soul that had carried them across lifetimes. It wasn't about the past or the future. It was about the now, and the love they chose to create within it. Gabriel had always considered himself a rational man, someone who navigated life with a steady hand and an open mind. But as the days passed after the night of revelations, something began to fester deep within him, something raw and unrelenting. It started subtly, a quiet whisper in the back of his mind whenever he saw Lyla with the dogs. It wasn't their bond he resented, he could admire its beauty, even its mystery, but the way it seemed to place him on the outside of her world. He would watch her sometimes, the way she moved through the house with the 4 dogs trailing behind her like silent guardians. When she sat by the fire, reading or humming softly to herself, they would gather around her in perfect synchronization. Archer would rest his massive head on her lap, Luna at her feet, while Miko and Raven flanked her sides. It was as though they were drawn to her by some magnetic force, their connection unspoken yet profound. It wasn't until one rainy afternoon that the jealousy began to show its teeth. Gabriel was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner, while Lyla sat cross-legged on the living room floor, brushing Archer's thick fur. Her voice carried to him in low murmurs, the melodic cadence of that strange, ancient language she had used before. The sound sent an unexplainable twinge through his chest, a sharp reminder of something he couldn't touch, something he could never be part of. "Do they ever talk back?" Gabriel asked, his tone sharper than he intended. Lyla looked up, startled, her fingers stilled against Archer's fur, and for a moment there was only the sound of rain tapping against the windows. "Not in words," she said cautiously. "But they don't need to. Their presence, their energy, it's enough." Gabriel forced a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. Must be nice having that kind of connection. Her brow furrowed as she set the brush aside and rose to her feet. The dogs stirred but stayed where they were, their watchful eyes tracking Gabriel's movements as he carried the cutting board to the counter. "What's that supposed to mean?" she asked, crossing the room to stand beside him. "Nothing," he said too quickly, turning his attention to the knife in his hand. "Forget I said anything." But Lyla didn't let it go. She placed a hand on his arm, stilling his movements. "Gabriel, talk to me. What's going on?" He set the knife down, exhaling heavily. I don't know where I fit in this. You and the dogs, you have this bond, this history that spans lifetimes. And me, I've been here for a few months." Lyla's expression softened, her hands sliding down to lace her fingers with his. "You're not competing with them, Gabriel." "Aren't I?" he said, his voice rising slightly. He pulled away from her, pacing the length of the kitchen. "They've been with you forever. They know things about you I never will. They've seen you in ways I can't even imagine." "They're part of my soul," Lyla said gently. "But that doesn't make my love for you any less real." "Doesn't it?" The words were out before he could stop them, and he immediately regretted their sharpness. He turned to her, his heart aching at the hurt in her eyes. "Lyla, I don't mean to. You feel like you're not enough," she said quietly, finishing the thought he couldn't bring himself to say aloud. Gabriel nodded, shame burning in his chest. "I love you, Lyla. But this connection you have with them, it's so much bigger than anything I can understand. And I'm afraid I'll never measure up." For a long moment, Lyla didn't respond. She simply stood there, her arms crossed, her gaze thoughtful. Then, without a word, she stepped forward and cupped his face in her hands. Her touch was gentle, her thumbs brushing against his cheeks as her eyes searched his. "You already measure up," she said firmly. "You're part of this now, whether you realize it or not. The dogs, they feel it too. That's why they've accepted you. Because they see you the way I do, as someone who belongs here with me." Gabriel's breath hitched at the intensity of her words, but the knot in his chest refused to loosen. "Then why do I feel like an outsider?" "Because you're still holding yourself apart," Lyla said softly. "You're trying to fit into this connection instead of realizing it's already grown to include you. The bond isn't just mine anymore, Gabriel. It's ours." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Gabriel closed his eyes, leaning into her touch as the warmth of her hands grounded him. "I want to believe that," he murmured. "But it's hard, I know," she said. "But let me show you." Lyla stepped back and gestured for him to follow her into the living room. The dogs rose instantly, their movements fluid as they formed a loose semicircle around her. She knelt in the center of the room, her hands resting lightly on her knees, and looked up at Gabriel with a quiet determination. "Sit with me," she said. Gabriel hesitated but eventually knelt beside her, the soft rug cushioning his knees. The dogs moved closer, their presence almost overwhelming as their eyes fixed on him. Archer was the first to approach, his massive head dipping to nudge Gabriel's hand. Tentatively, Gabriel reached out, his fingers brushing through the thick fur. "Close your eyes," Lyla instructed. "And just listen." Gabriel obeyed, his pulse quickening as he focused on the steady rhythm of his breathing. At first, there was nothing but the sound of rain outside, the crackle of the fire. But then, slowly, he began to feel it, a faint hum, like the distant vibration of a string. It grew stronger, wrapping around him like a warm embrace, and he realized it was coming from the dogs, from Lyla, from himself. The sensation was unlike anything he had ever experienced. It wasn't just a feeling, it was a knowing, a sense of belonging that went deeper than logic or explanation. In that moment, he understood what Lyla had meant. The bond wasn't separate from him, it included him, surrounded him, welcomed him. When he opened his eyes, Lyla was watching him, her expression soft but unreadable. "Do you feel it?" she asked. Gabriel nodded, his voice caught in his throat. "I do." The dogs pressed closer, their warmth a comforting weight against him. Archer rested his head on Gabriel's knee, his eyes filled with quiet understanding. Luna leaned into his side, her tail wagging softly, while Miko and Raven settled at his feet. For the first time, the knot in Gabriel's chest began to loosen. He looked at Lyla, his heart full, and reached for her hand. "I'm sorry," he said, "for doubting, for letting my insecurities get in the way." "You don't have to apologize," she said, squeezing his hand. "This isn't easy, but you're here, and that's what matters." Gabriel leaned forward, capturing her lips in a kiss that was both tender and fervent. It was a kiss filled with unspoken promises, a silent vow to trust, to love, to let go of his fears. When they pulled apart, he rested his forehead against hers, their breaths mingling in the quiet. "I'm with you," he said. "In this life, in this bond, I'm with you." Lyla smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Always." And as they sat together, surrounded by the warmth of the dogs and the crackling fire, Gabriel felt the first flickers of peace settle over him. It wasn't the end of his journey, but it was a beginning one filled with love, trust, and the promise of something eternal. The weeks following Gabriel's acceptance of Lyla's bond with the dogs were a delicate balancing act. The revelation had shaken the foundation of his understanding, but it also opened a door to a new world, a world where love transcended lifetimes and connections wove through the fabric of existence itself. Yet, for all the beauty of this newfound knowledge, it demanded something from him. Acceptance wasn't enough. Faith wasn't enough. To truly belong, Gabriel had to prove himself, not just to Lyla, but to the ancient bond that now included him. The trial began on a night when the world seemed suspended between light and shadow. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale silver glow over the forest that surrounded Lyla's home. Gabriel had been restless all evening, pacing the living room while Lyla watched him with quiet understanding. She seemed to sense his turmoil, but she didn't press him. Instead, she waited, patient as ever, for him to voice the storm raging inside him. "I feel like I'm on the edge of something," he finally admitted, running a hand through his hair. "Like there's this barrier I can't cross." Lyla nodded, setting aside the book she'd been reading. "Because there is. You've accepted the bond, but now you need to trust it, to let it guide you." Gabriel frowned, sitting down across from her. "What does that mean, trusting it?" "It means letting go of control," she said softly. "Letting the bond show you what it needs from you. It's not something you can force, Gabriel. It's something you have to surrender to." Her words unsettled him, but they also stirred something deep within, a longing to understand, to fully immerse himself in the connection he now shared with her and the dogs. "How do I start?" Lyla stood, her movements fluid and graceful, and extended her hand. "Come with me." Gabriel hesitated for only a moment before taking her hand. The dogs rose as one, their silent presence a steadying force as they followed the couple outside. The air was cool, carrying the scent of pine and earth, and the forest seemed alive with an energy Gabriel couldn't quite name. They walked in silence, the dogs moving in perfect synchronization around them, until they reached a clearing illuminated by the moonlight. At the center of the clearing stood an ancient oak tree, its gnarled branches stretching toward the sky like the fingers of a giant. Beneath it, a circle of stones formed a crude altar, their surfaces etched with runes that seemed to shimmer faintly in the darkness. Gabriel's breath caught at the sight. "This is a sacred place," Lyla said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's where the bond was first forged, long before this life. It's where I come when I need guidance, and now it's where you'll face your trial." Gabriel turned to her, his heart pounding. "What kind of trial?" "One of trust." Of love. She stepped closer, her hand resting lightly on his chest. "The bond will show you what you need to see. But it won't be easy. It will test you, push you to your limits, and only you can decide how to face it." The weight of her words settled over him, but he nodded, determination hardening in his chest. "I'm ready." Lyla smiled, a mixture of pride and sadness flickering in her eyes. "I'll be here when it's over." Before he could ask what she meant, Lyla stepped back, the dogs moving to form a circle around him. Their eyes glowed faintly in the moonlight, their presence both comforting and commanding. As Gabriel stood in the center of the clearing, the air grew heavy, charged with an energy that made his skin tingle. And then the world shifted. Gabriel blinked, and the clearing was gone. He found himself standing in a vast expanse of golden grass, the horizon stretching endlessly in every direction. The sky above was a vivid shade of blue, but there was something unsettling about the stillness, as if the world were holding its breath. He turned, searching for Lyla, but she was nowhere to be found. Instead, he saw the dogs no longer the companions he knew, but glowing, ethereal beings, their forms shimmering with an otherworldly light. The great shepherd stepped forward, its massive frame towering over him, and its voice resonated in his mind like a bell. The bond is ancient and unyielding. To claim your place within it, you must face the truths of your heart and the choices of your soul. What does that mean? Gabriel asked, his voice trembling. The dog didn't answer. Instead, the world around him began to shift and blur, images flickering before his eyes like the pages of a book turned too quickly. He saw himself standing on a battlefield, sword in hand, his body drenched in sweat and blood. Lyla was there, her face streaked with dirt and tears, her voice rising above the chaos as she called his name. But Gabriel turned away, consumed by fear and anger, leaving her to face the enemy alone. The scene changed, and he was standing in a grand hall, dressed in fine clothes that felt foreign against his skin. Lyla stood at the edge of the room, her expression pleading as he argued with a faceless figure. The words were muffled, but the meaning was clear. He had chosen ambition over her, sacrificing their love for power. Each vision hit him like a blow, the weight of his past choices crashing down on him. He had failed her, again and again, in ways he hadn't known were possible. The guilt was suffocating, and he sank to his knees, his chest heaving with the effort to breathe. "I didn't know," he whispered. "I didn't remember. Now you do," the voice said. "What will you do with this truth?" Gabriel closed his eyes, the memories swirling in his mind like a storm. He thought of Lyla, her strength, her patience, her unwavering love. She had never judged him for the choices of their past lives, never held his failures against him. And yet, he had let his own insecurities drive a wedge between them in this life. "I'll make it right," he said, his voice firm despite the tears streaming down his face. "I'll do whatever it takes to prove that I'm worthy of her, of this bond." The light around him began to dim, the world collapsing in on itself until he was back in the clearing beneath the ancient oak. Lyla was there, her eyes wide with concern as she rushed to his side. "Gabriel," she said, her voice trembling. "What happened?" He looked at her, his heart aching with the weight of everything he had seen. "I've made so many mistakes," he said. "But I swear, Lyla, I'll spend the rest of this life making it right." She knelt beside him, her hands cupping his face. "You don't have to make it right," she said softly. "You just have to choose me. Here, now. That's all I've ever wanted." Gabriel reached for her, pulling her into a fierce embrace. The dogs gathered around them, their presence a silent affirmation of the bond they now shared. And as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Gabriel felt a quiet certainty settle in his chest. The trial was over, but the journey was just beginning. And for the first time, he was ready to face it together. The storm came without warning, a tempest of wind and rain that lashed against the windows of Lyla's home. Gabriel stood at the edge of the living room, watching as the trees bent under the force of the gale. The air inside was thick with tension, the unspoken weight of what was to come pressing down on him like a lead blanket. Lyla sat on the floor near the fireplace, her legs crossed beneath her, her hands resting on the head of Archer, who sat beside her with quiet vigilance. The other dogs circled around her, their postures alert, their eyes gleaming in the flickering firelight. Gabriel turned to her, his chest tight. "This is it, isn't it? The last test?" Lyla nodded, her expression calm but solemn. "It is. The bond has accepted you, but there's still one final step, one final choice." "What kind of choice?" he asked, his voice rough with uncertainty. Lyla looked at him, her amber eyes filled with both love and sorrow. "To fully join the bond, you have to face the moment that fractured it in the past, to confront the choice that caused our separation." Gabriel's heart sank. He had seen glimpses of that moment during the trial's, visions of himself turning away from her, driven by fear, anger, or ambition. But the idea of reliving it, of stepping into that pain and guilt, was almost too much to bear. "What if I fail?" he whispered, the vulnerability in his voice surprising even himself. "You won't," Lyla said softly, rising to her feet. She crossed the room to stand in front of him, her hands reaching for his. "Because you're not the man you were in those lives. You've already proven that. All that's left is for you to let go of the past and choose the present. To choose us." Her words steadied him, and he nodded, his fingers tightening around hers. "What do I need to do?" Lyla smiled faintly, her lips trembling with emotion. "Trust me." She led him to the center of the room, where the dogs had gathered. They formed a perfect circle, their bodies radiating a quiet strength that seemed to pulse through the air. Lyla guided Gabriel to sit beside her, their knees touching as she reached for a small vial of golden liquid on the mantel. "This will take us to the memory," she explained. "It's not just about seeing it. You'll have to live it again, to feel everything as it happened. Only then can you change it." Gabriel swallowed hard, his throat dry. "And if I can't, you can," she said firmly. "Because you love me. And that love is stronger than anything we've faced before." Her confidence gave him strength, and he nodded. Together, they drank the elixir, its warmth spreading through him like liquid sunlight. The room began to blur, the dog's glowing forms the last thing he saw before the world dissolved into light. Gabriel opened his eyes to find himself standing on a windswept cliff, the air cold and sharp against his skin. The sky above was a stormy gray, the ocean below crashing against jagged rocks with a deafening roar. He turned and saw her Lyla, dressed in a flowing white gown that billowed in the wind. Her hair was wild, her face streaked with tears as she stared at him with a mixture of love and despair. "Gabriel," she called, her voice breaking. "Please, don't do this." He took a step toward her, but his body felt heavy, as though invisible chains were holding him back. He realized with a jolt that he was not himself, he was the man he had been in that life, a version of himself driven by fear and pride. He could feel the weight of his anger, his frustration, but beneath it all was a deep, aching love for the woman standing before him. "I can't," he heard himself say, the words like knives in his throat. "I'm not strong enough to protect you. You deserve someone better." Tears streamed down Lyla's face as she shook her head. "You don't have to be perfect, Gabriel. You just have to stay." But he turned away, the pain in his chest unbearable. The memory was unfolding exactly as it had before, the same choices leading to the same heartbreak. Gabriel felt powerless, trapped in the cycle of his own mistakes. "No," he said, his voice trembling. "Not this time." The chains that bound him began to loosen as he fought against the pull of the memory. He turned back to Lyla, his heart pounding. "I won't leave you again." She looked at him, her eyes wide with hope and disbelief. "Gabriel." He stepped closer, his hands reaching for hers. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "For every time I failed you. For every time I let my fears drive us apart. But not this time. This time I'm choosing you." The storm around them seemed to pause, the wind stilling as the weight of his words settled over them. Lyla's tears turned to a radiant smile as she threw her arms around him, holding him as though she would never let go. "You've always had the strength," she whispered. "You just needed to see it." The dogs appeared then, their forms glowing brighter than ever as they surrounded the two of them. Gabriel felt their warmth, their acceptance, as though they were welcoming him into a circle that had been waiting for him all along. The light grew brighter, enveloping them, until the world dissolved once more. Gabriel opened his eyes to find himself back in the living room, Lyla's arms still wrapped around him. The fire crackled softly, the storm outside reduced to a gentle rain. The dogs lay around them, their presence calm and steady, their eyes reflecting the peace that now filled the room. "You did it," Lyla said, her voice thick with emotion. "You broke the cycle." Gabriel pulled back to look at her, his hands cradling her face. "I couldn't have done it without you." She smiled, her lips brushing against his in a kiss that was soft and lingering, filled with the promise of a new beginning. When they pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his, their breaths mingling in the quiet. "We're free now," she said. "Free to live this life together." Gabriel nodded, his heart swelling with a love that felt infinite. "And I'll never leave you again." The dogs moved closer, their warmth a tangible reminder of the bond they now shared. For the first time, Gabriel felt truly at peace not just with Lyla, but with himself. The past no longer held power over him, and the future was theirs to create. As the night deepened, Gabriel held Lyla close, the dogs curled around them like guardians of their love. And in that moment he knew they had found something eternal, a love that transcended time, yet thrived in the present, stronger than ever before. The morning after Gabriel's final trial, the world seemed different, not just the world outside, but the world between them. Lyla stirred beside him in bed, her hair spilling over the pillow like a dark river, her breath soft and steady. The weight of her presence against him was grounding, a quiet reminder that they had made it through the storm together. For the first time, Gabriel felt not just relief but an almost overwhelming gratitude. The past no longer loomed over them like a shadow. It had been woven into the fabric of their present, no longer a burden but a part of their shared story. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and she stirred, her eyes fluttering open to meet his. The warmth in her amber gaze sent a wave of emotion through him. She smiled sleepily, her fingers finding his on the pillow. "Morning," she murmured, her voice husky with sleep. "Morning," he replied, his voice soft but steady. "How do you feel?" Lyla stretched, her body curling into his like it belonged there, and smiled. "Lighter. Like a weight I didn't even realize I was carrying is finally gone." Gabriel leaned in, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Me too." The dogs stirred at the foot of the bed, their soft breaths and the faint sound of shifting paws filling the room. Archer stretched first, his massive frame moving with quiet grace, followed by Luna, Miko, and Raven. They didn't intrude, they never did. Instead, they watched the pair with a calm, knowing presence that had become a source of comfort for Gabriel. It was no longer strange to him, this sense of shared connection. It was simply part of who they were now. Lyla sat up, her fingers brushing over Gabriel's hand as she turned to face the dogs. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice filled with emotion, "for everything." The dogs seemed to understand her words, their gazes steady and full of something Gabriel could only describe as reverence. Archer padded over to Lyla, resting his head on her lap as she stroked his fur with a tenderness that made Gabriel's chest ache. The others followed, each taking their place around her, forming a perfect circle of protection and devotion. Gabriel watched the scene unfold, and for the first time he didn't feel like an outsider. He felt included. Not just by Lyla, but by the bond itself. He reached out, his hand finding Miko's golden fur, and felt a warmth spread through him as the dog leaned into his touch. "You're part of this now," Lyla said, her gaze meeting his. "Truly part of it." Gabriel nodded, his throat tightening with emotion. "And I wouldn't want it any other way." They spent the morning together in quiet simplicity, cooking breakfast while the dogs lounged by the fireplace. Gabriel felt the shift in their rhythm, how natural it was now to move around each other, to share the space of their lives without the tension that had once lingered between them. He had always loved Lyla, but now that love felt deeper, fuller, as though the trials they had endured had forged something unbreakable between them. Later, they walked through the forest, the crisp autumn air carrying the scent of pine and fallen leaves. Lyla's hand was warm in his, her steps light as they followed a winding trail that led to a small clearing by the river. The dogs ran ahead, their joy infectious as they bounded through the underbrush, their movements perfectly in sync. "They're different now," Gabriel said, watching the dogs play. "Or maybe it's me. I feel like I see them differently." Lyla squeezed his hand, her smile soft. "It's you. You're part of the bond now. You're connected to them, to me, in a way that goes beyond words." Gabriel turned to her, his heart swelling with love and awe. "Does it ever feel overwhelming to you, knowing that this bond will carry us through lifetimes?" She shook her head, her eyes shimmering with emotion. "It used to. I used to feel like it was too much, like I was carrying the weight of something I couldn't control. But now with you, it feels like freedom, like I don't have to carry it alone anymore." Her words struck a chord deep within him, and he pulled her into his arms, holding her close as the sound of the river murmured around them. "You'll never have to carry it alone again," he promised. "I'm here, in this life, and whatever comes after." Their kiss was slow and unhurried, the kind of kiss that spoke of promises kept and futures imagined. Gabriel felt the world fade away, leaving only the warmth of her lips, the softness of her body against his, and the steady hum of the bond that now tethered them together. It was as though time itself had paused to honor the moment, to give them the space to simply be. When they finally pulled apart, Lyla rested her forehead against his, her breath mingling with his in the cool air. "I love you," she whispered, her voice trembling with sincerity. "In every life, I'll always love you." Gabriel smiled, his hands cupping her face as he looked into her eyes. "And I'll always find you." The dogs returned then, their presence grounding them in the present. Archer nudged Gabriel's side, his eyes bright with mischief, and Luna barked once, a sharp, joyful sound that made them both laugh. They spent the rest of the afternoon by the river, tossing sticks for Raven to retrieve and watching Miko and Luna wrestle in the grass. It was simple, unremarkable in its details, yet Gabriel felt as though he were living a moment carved out of eternity itself. As the sun began to set, casting the forest in hues of gold and crimson, they made their way back to the house. Lyla leaned into him as they walked, her head resting on his shoulder, and Gabriel felt a peace he hadn't known was possible. The bond wasn't just something he had accepted, it was something he cherished, something that had enriched his love for Lyla in ways he couldn't have imagined. That night, as they lay together in bed, the dogs curled at their feet, Gabriel traced patterns on Lyla's back, his touch gentle and reverent. She sighed contentedly, her body melting into his as though she had been made to fit against him. "You know," she said, her voice drowsy but warm, "this is what I've always wanted. Not just the bond, but this. A life with you. A life where we can be present, no matter how many lifetimes we've lived before." Gabriel pressed a kiss to her shoulder, his lips lingering against her skin. "And that's exactly what we'll have. A life in the now, grounded in everything we've been and everything we'll become." Lyla turned to face him, her hand resting on his chest as she looked at him with a love so profound it made his breath catch. "Together," she said. "Always," he replied. As sleep claimed them, Gabriel felt the bond hum softly around them, a gentle reminder of the connection they now shared. It wasn't just about the past or the future, it was about the present, the moments they were building together, one heartbeat at a time. And in that quiet, sacred space, Gabriel knew they had found something eternal.